I was born in Birmingham, Alabama, but in my early years of life we traveled to 4 different states because my father was managing War Production Board for the Second World War, and we lived in different cities. And therefore I became rather aggressive, and God began to work with my parents and me about the same time. They had not really understood the gospel until they got involved in a Bible college in Birmingham, and so they came to Christ as new believers while I was an older child. And during that time I was resistant to the gospel, and I was following activities that didn't honor the Lord, and God began to deal with me. One of my mother's friends invited me to help out with a poor children's Bible club that was meeting in parts of Birmingham, and I agreed to do that because it was just a matter of managing the kids' activities. But then one day they asked me to teach the lesson next week, and I couldn't think of a good reason not to, so I took the lesson home with me, and in the privacy of my bedroom, as I was preparing that lesson, I realized that I had not yet received Christ as my Savior, and that He needed to be Lord and Savior, not just Savior. He needed to be Lord of my life. And I accepted Christ as Savior, preparing for that lesson. And subsequently found that I could not grow in Birmingham where I was because our church was not really teaching the Word that well, and I was getting exposed to a lot of things that kids do when they go into high school, and didn't have a good answer, good representation of my faith. So at that time we had Bible college meetings on Monday night, which would involve special speakers, and they were just for the public. And one time we heard Dr. Pierre DuBose, who ran a mission school that he had set up in Florida, near Orlando, for missionary kids. Turns out he was the grandson of a missionary to China himself, whose name was Hampton DuBose. You can look that one up. Hampton DuBose was, back in the 19th century, a pretty famous missionary in China. So I talked my father into driving down there while he was doing some selling of trailers. By then he was building and selling trailers, and we went and saw that it was of what I needed, and school was starting in about 3 weeks, and they'd had one dropout just the week before. They usually fill their quota in the spring, so they offered me a place, and I agreed to come, and packed up and took off as a sophomore in high school and began to go to school there. While at Hampton DuBose Academy, we met a lot of missionaries, had a lot of Bible teaching, and even the missionaries that were killed in Ecuador were related to the school, and we were watching them on shortwave radio when they were killed, and so saw all that go by. So after growing in that situation, I began to get involved in Christian service. And I think if there's one thing I want to really put across to you, it's that you need to get involved in God's service early on. If you make a commitment and let Him grow you, you need to be discipled. So I worked at their camp one summer, and then I worked in Word of Life camp in New York, and the rest of my high school and one of my college years. And while I was in college, I worked in Southside Chicago with African American kids, and both children and adults and high schoolers. And that's one of the things that God did when He called me to come into missions. I needed to get started. But I was convinced as I came through high school and came to college that I was going to go into medicine to serve the Lord. And so I set about getting prepared for medical college, and then in medical college we were ministering in Birmingham still, and we had a clinic and the rescue mission in town, and I was very involved, and later on in missions programs in my church at that time, which was Briarwood Presbyterian Church in Birmingham, and I was on one of their earlier missions committees that had only started up at as a church for about 3 years at that time. So we got a good introduction to missions. And later on then, after going through medical college and internship, I got drafted to go to Vietnam. I had married my wife in my senior year of medical college, so I left her to go to nursing school while I went to Vietnam for a year. And because President Lyndon Johnson had decided to help the psychological warfare in Vietnam, he actually set up a program by which we were Military Provincial Hospital Assistance Program. It's abbreviated MILFAP. And I was in the first group of teams that went out to do that. We had 3 teams from the Army, 2 from the Navy, and 1 from the Air Force. And I was in one of the Army teams. So I got to learn a bit of Vietnamese and experience some of Asia. And we had a Bible study for a while with the team there. And I was doing pediatrics, even though I was not specialized yet. I had some pediatric training in my internship. So when I came back from Vietnam, I worked in the Martin Army Hospital in preventive medicine with the Vietnamese troops that were learning how to be officers in the Vietnamese Army. And I knew what kind of diseases they had because I'd already been working with Vietnamese people. And following that, I had felt that God wanted me to go ahead and take a complete training program in surgery. So I did that, which time we had 3 of our 4 kids, and I had inquired in the Evangelical Alliance mission about their medical work. I knew several missionaries from that mission, and I wrote to their different medical works. There were 8 at the time, and I only heard back right away from one who was in Taiwan, and he said, "Can you get here by April of next year?" So I said, "Well, that's God telling me something there." So I was able to take an early sitting for the board examination in surgery, got my board certification. Then we started doing deputation in February after I'd taken that exam. And in April we were fully supported and went to the field in Taiwan. And there I was involved in mission hospital ministry for 26 years and got to do all kinds of things that are unusual. But I have to give you some illustrations of what God does in these situations. We had a fellow come in one time that had a motorcycle accident, and he had tattooed dragons all over him. So I had to be very careful when I cut through the dragons to put him back together right. He was a member of a dragon gang, and they had a reputation. But he had broken his collarbone, and it had lacerated the artery behind the collarbone, and he was in shock. And we rushed him into emergency surgery and were able to repair the artery. And after he came around, I said, you're in the dragon gang, but do you accept Christ as Savior? He did. He knew the Lord had preserved his life, and he changed his name to Paul. And he did some missionary work of his own. Another time we had the sister of our nursing supervisor come in. She was not a believer, and she came in a coma because she had obstruction of her kidneys by cancer. And so I was stuck on what to do with her. At that time, most people didn't have insurance in Taiwan, and they had to depend on contributed services. That changed later. So I prayed over her, and we talked about it, and I decided to try to get a way to drain her kidneys because they were blocked. So about 3 days after putting a drain into her kidneys, she woke up from her coma, and I asked her about her feelings about Christianity and Jesus, and she says, well, I'm a believer. And I said, well, when did that happen? And she said, well, when you prayed over me before I could talk to you, and I was in a coma, I accepted Christ as my Savior. So we never know what God's going to do. And there are many stories like that. There's a fellow that came in. He had been an athletic star, and he worked at the sugarcane factory, and his leg got caught in a sugarcane threshing machine, which just terribly messed up his leg, and he had sugarcane all embedded in his leg. And his wife brought him over and said she was working at Mackay Hospital, which just opened a branch in town, and they wanted to amputate his leg high above the hip. And she said, can you do anything with him? So we prayed and talked about it and looked at his leg and decided we could try. And I don't know how many times I prayed on that man. Probably 10 or more. Because we had to borrow bone from other places and connect things that weren't normally connected, and remove sugar cane in large quantities. But after about half a year, he was able to walk on that leg. And I said, well, Mr. Huang, what do you believe about Jesus? He said, well, Jesus saved me. And I said, oh, that's great. Tell me more about it. He said, well, he saved my leg. He knew he'd been prayed over a lot. And he later on, about a half year later, he took Jesus as his spiritual Savior too. But you never know what's going on in people's minds. So we were serving in Taiwan 26 years. Then we were able to get a national board of directors and national leadership for the hospital. And so we took an early retirement from the mission and retired to Colorado. And I came over to Columbia several times while we were in Colorado and said howdy. But I was doing surgery there. And then in several different states, I did some locum tenens surgery. And we were able to stay involved in missions. And we developed missions in the church where we were in Colorado. It was a very small church and grew much bigger and had a big missions program. And so I felt very glad to be able to be involved in missions here too. And I think the biggest lesson I want you to learn is, if God calls you to do something, get started. Keep going. Get discipled. Get in the Word. Get prepared and do things. And God will honor it and see many people come to Christ and change their minds about what their testimony really means to them.